The viewership of my earlier essays thrust me into a role I didn't expect. As a combat sports superfan, I was already fluent in the YouTube creator ecosystem, so meeting analysts I had long placed on my own personal Mount Rushmore was surreal, and then clarifying. One thing nearly all of them have in common is that their most viral moment is also the one they regret. Adidas, 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 Adidas deal, Adidas deal, Adidas deal, Adidas deal, Adidas deal. Now I have taken essentially the last 3 years off from posting long-form content, but I have been writing constantly. The viewer question that inspired my last major project is perfectly paralleled by the timeline of this one, except this time it was a question from a fighter's sibling, not a fan. In that essay, I tried to explain a concept by describing French feudal guild relationships, causing Ray Longo to refer to me as kooky. At the time, I didn't have a word for what I was circling, but when I talk to fans on the outgroup side of the information spectrum, it becomes jarring how many of you drastically overestimate the UFC as a corporation. What becomes obvious when talking to the in-group is why. Information inside the UFC barely moves laterally at all. That isn't inefficiency, it's purposeful, structural information tyranny. Theoretically, there has to be a line between disclosure and privacy. I absolutely recognize that critique. But the distance between healthy informational privacy and where the UFC operates is genuinely stunning. One of the clearest aspects of the UFC's internal communication network is its feudal structure. Now don't worry, coach. That's as far as we're going this time. The difference between the average hardcore fan's knowledge of the internal politics of the UFC and the average fighter's is negligible to the point of being absent. This creates an information hierarchy littered with siloed decision-making, which is complicated by the authoritarian top-down nature of the structure. What emerged is an informational fiefdom under the king of combat, Dana White. The most visible matchmakers, those familiar faces at every numbered pay-per-view, function sort of like dukes. This is where the first break between perception and operational reality occurs. The dukes are more powerful perceptually than they are practically. They are more like responsible clerks to Dana rather than genuine decision makers. Fighters showed me this in their response to simple questions like, what happens if your opponent pulls out of a fight? Everything becomes abstract and foggy for them, when it should be very clearly the fighter's matchmaker. Sean Shelby handles the lighter men's weight classes and most of the women's, or Mick Maynard for the higher weights and the rest of the women. The answer to my question varies wildly, but has become more and more Jason House or his various spokes that branch downward from him. These mismatched parts assemble into an inefficient short-term decision-making information pipeline, which we see constantly. Every time a fighter gets surprised by an announcement of their next fight before they were aware is another example. But to understand whether this dysfunction matters, we need to widen our gaze upward. Short-term missteps are tolerable when long-term narrative coherence remains intact. My observations point to a notable decline in that sphere, best exemplified by a comparison of the international tours featuring Conor and Aldo with the build-up of Islam Makhachev's double champ fight against Jack Della Maddalena. That's an easy nit to pick. Islam spends most of his time in Dagestan, so would be unlikely to participate. I get that. UFC 318, however, does not get a pass. Dustin is looking to retire, and this gives him one last chance to make a major media splash. Holloway is transitioning to the end of his career, and this makes for a can't-miss narrative beat to open the close of that career. And Joe Rogan didn't even show up. He was too busy deciding immigration policy over dinner with the president. Now, I'm not claiming I could do their jobs, but look at the UFC 318 main card honestly and tell me it delivered the emotional weight its narrative potential demanded. Well, they played Frank Sinatra as he walked out. Moments like that are supposed to carry narrative weight, but symbols only work when there's an audience still invested enough to receive them. The problem isn't that the UFC has forgotten how to stage moments, it's that the system no longer rewards the kind of long-term investment required to make those moments matter. Rather than rehash familiar critiques of the brand, it's easier to explain this through an analogy. I used to manage a restaurant, and I had a server that got constant complaints. She was always super direct and running around the restaurant frantically. The owner was constantly trying to get me to, quote, fix the problem, whatever that meant to him. So one day I asked her, why are you always rushing? She then outlined an economic thesis that I have come to call the Iridium strategy. She told me that the faster she can get a customer seated, fed, and out of their table, the faster she can do it again. If the average person tips between 15 to 20%, then by increasing her table volume, she was inherently stuffing the ballot box in terms of nightly revenue, right? For ease of remembrance, we're going to call her Jason House. The inverse was another server, who we are going to call Tim Simpson. Now, Tim Simpson implicitly understood what I did. You can only turn tables so fast before it impacts service. Tim Simpson recognized that she needed to maximize turn time efficiency, but the real lever was turning 15 to 20% into a guaranteed 20. Tim Simpson's particular genius was her ability to upsell the tables. Her trick was to ask them if they wanted to replace their free rice with fried rice, which was an extra $3 at the time. Who doesn't want fried rice? $3 isn't shit in the late 2010s. Then Tim Simpson would ask, what kind of fried rice? If you go with chicken, it's an extra $2, but we're already spending $3 on fried rice, so fuck it. Tim Simpson just turned an $18 chicken teriyaki into a $23 chicken teriyaki with chicken fried rice on the side. Now, when Tim Simpson got sat with a family party full of children who didn't want our sushi, that's basically like turning a table from 2 parents and 3 kids to a bill for 2 parents and 4. And that's simply because I had Tim Simpson take the table, right? Higher marginal revenue for my corporate overlords, and it scratches my OCD itch to earn my surf pay. We're going to call her strategy the Chosen Advisory Group strategy. Naturally, we all want to have Tim Simpson as our server over Jason House, right? I mean, both are going to deliver the food, but one's getting complaints, and one is increasing our revenue. Now, this is a true story aside from the names. And I made a presentation to the owner explaining this exact narrative with their actual names, and made the case that Tim Simpson should train all the new servers. Unfortunately, our bartender came into work hungover after he no-call, no-showed a busy weekend to go fishing and called Tim Simpson a cunt in front of customers, and the owners refused to apologize to her, so she quit. You see, the bartender, let's call him Ali Abdelaziz, is friends with the owner from way back, so no way are they firing him, right? I quit my job immediately because I had always hated Ali and refused to work with him anymore. Moral of the story, incentives drive behavior, and the UFC's incentives are structurally misaligned for long-term growth. Specifically, imagine if the owner had said to me that not only was Tim Simpson not going to train new servers, but Jason House was going to serve an ever greater portion of our customers because reasons. A system that suppresses labor costs cannot afford long-term narrative investment. Narrative cohesion gives the fighters more negotiating power than the institution can tolerate. Now, my last gambling essay was bloated because I felt like I needed to heavily over-explain my thesis because I was sort of going at the king. Now that I realize he has no clothes, I'm going to let loose a bit with how we proceed. Whenever gambling touches a sport, regulators prioritize perception just as much as actual integrity because both are existential risks to them. In August of 2022, I and many others watched live as James Krause admitted to gambling on UFC fights he was involved with, as well as those he wasn't. If I am an executive in the UFC and I hear this, alarm bells are immediately going off. That is a major conflict of interest that could jeopardize the public image of gambling integrity in the UFC. Publicly, crickets. Privately, I have absolutely no idea. So I choose to assume the best, that they did in fact begin planning for a future inevitable scandal. And that scandal came months later, on November 5th, 2022, when Krause coach Derek Minner faced Shailan Nurdimbeki, receiving anomalous levels of pre-fight action pointing towards Minner losing early by finish. The fight then lasted 67 seconds officially, with Minner losing by leg injury. In my prior essay, I contextualized this as not a cut-and-dry case of malfeasance, although it certainly smelled like it. That was where I incorporated TJ Dillashaw's mentality mixed with the truth of health insurance claims for fighters. If a fighter injures themselves training for a fight, it will only be covered in their policy if they successfully make weight and show up before the cage door closes. Fighters then tell the post-fight medical check they injured that piece of their anatomy, crucially, in the fight, not before. Their policies cover injuries incurred fighting for the UFC, not training for the UFC. Keep that in mind. The fight between Minner and Nurdenbecki smells fishy as fuck, but the structural weaknesses in health insurance claims throws a ton of fog over a clear cut and dry case of fraud. Literally the next day, third-party betting integrity firms alerted major commissions and regulators to the situation I just described. So first up is what to do with Krause, who again had publicly stated he bet on his own fighters, and one of his fighters just was a part of a fight with anomalous betting. Easy answer. Krause is suspended within 2 weeks by the Nevada State Athletic Commission. But here is the second most important pause. These pauses are when our public information goes dry, and time simply passes without answer. This is when that executive that said this could be a problem gets charged with coming up with a response that mitigates PR fallout but assures betting integrity. And the UFC essentially folded its cards and waited for the next hand. There is no world where this was a genuinely good choice from a business stewardship perspective. At best, it could be spun as a sort of stoic price of doing business type thing. But as you will see, that just strengthens my oppositional hypothesis from the last video. Reading the tea leaves, a number of Canadian betting commissions were not pleased by the UFC's lackluster response, so they banned or otherwise limited UFC betting indefinitely. This is why I went into depth about the various gambling deals they had signed. Because if you are getting paid to have an official gambling partner in Ontario, and Ontario just banned or otherwise limited your gambling, you are now in financial trouble. What kind of trouble? Only the UFC really knows. I can't speak to that, but I can tell you it wasn't big enough for them to act immediately. Because 24 hours later, Alberta follows, cutting off even more revenue to the gambling partners paying the UFC to advertise them. So then they acted. They banned all Krause-affiliated fighters, extremely broad and difficult to enforce considering one of those Krause fighters was their off-and-on flyweight champion Brandon Moreno. Important to note, a key element of Endeavor's high-level strategy with the brand was an aggressive campaign to increase interest in Mexico and other Spanish-speaking countries. Now, Brandon Moreno is from Mexico and is arguably the biggest star in the male ranks they had yet produced from a populist perspective to that market. Brandon's "Si se puede" speech upon winning the belt is used in memes that I still see to this day. That is earned crossover appeal, and ostensibly, he was just banned from the UFC. So he moved camps to be within the rules of the ban and continued competing. It should be noted that the story surrounding Moreno's camp shift is an essay in and of itself based on my research. Now, I released my video in December of 2022, so I was unaware of a couple major developments coming down the pike. Literally the next month, ESPN reported that Krause had operated as a middleman for an offshore sportsbook since at least 2019. One could describe this as a parallel economy within the UFC's ecosystem. I would call it highly unethical. After that dropped, the UFC updated code of conduct regulations to try and satiate the wolves like me, nipping at their proverbial heels. In March of this year, Jeff Molina received a 36-month suspension, roughly corresponding to time served, and Derek Minner received a 29-month one, which was admittedly less than time served. This is a sign of embarrassment on behalf of the NSAC, who clearly have no actual regulatory teeth to do anything, and were probably getting hounded by the defendants' lawyers, so they handed down punishments retroactively explaining their actions. Now look, that's all fine and dandy. UFC botched a PR attempt, but at least they learned their lesson. I have put this part off long enough, and I don't want to get too into the weeds because it deserves a much larger treatment in my forthcoming Decline and Fall video. But this Paramount deal is an absolute catastrophe waiting to happen for the UFC brand. Don't quote me financials when they signed a deal with a brand that was about to answer the question, what happens when a mass media platform has to sell its major assets for scrap like pre-Disney Marvel with the Incredible Hulk? Thankfully, our God Emperor lifted his legal hex on the brand, granting the son of Oracle full license to burn daddy's money, making industrial-grade schlock, while coasting on the one thing keeping his reputation alive, financing one of the only legacy rewrites that actually worked. Shout out Carter Burwell, the wicked flea still slaps. Now let's do what the UFC rarely wants you to do. Follow the money. Okay, so the UFC stated in its announcement of the deal that it hosts approximately 43 events a year. So we can take the average yearly figure, divide it by 43, and that's how much the fighter should get, right? Wrong. No sports league goes about streaming rights in this way. In a perfect world, it's 50-50 ownership and fighters, but we live in a dying empire. So let's call it an even 58-42 ownership versus fighters to put the UFC in the same universe as real sports media properties like the NFL and NBA. So theoretically, the fighters should be making 42% of the $25.6 million per event average that Paramount is paying. The average card comes out to about 11 to 12 bouts, so for fairness, I'm going to say 24 fighters are splitting that 42%. Each fighter then would be getting paid just under $450,000 per fight. That's not top fighters, that's the average minimum salary, assuming a 42% cap split. Now I can hear my dad, a finance guy, yelling at me, "Jason, you're such a fucking disappointment. Why don't you actually write about something meaningful?" You're right, Dad. That is obtusely unaware of context. Based on reporting, the payment plan from Paramount to the UFC is backloaded, so the average streaming rights revenue per event goes up later in the deal, meaning that my calculations are flawed. It also flattens out the pay curve for talent, which is unacceptable. So let's apply a bell curve to my average calculation and just squint a bit at it. I'm going to set a per fight minimum payout of $400,000, which would essentially halve my prior calculation, making them much closer to realistic. So for each fight, the winning fighter gets a minimum of $250,000, and the losing fighter gets a minimum of $150,000. That seems fair. If we still assume a 42% split, that leaves us with just under $6 million to redistribute due to talent. I am thinking we set a minimum for main and co-main fighters with a flat payout irrespective of a win-loss so that we don't insult our top guys and gals, right? At minimum, both fighters in the main event make $1 million. At minimum in the co-main, it's $750,000. That leaves me with $3.25 million to spend per event. Performance bonuses are stupid, but let's give $500,000 to each participant in the fight of the night, with the winner of said fight getting an additional $250,000. I still have $2 million, which I'm going to leave aside to redistribute in a way to entice fighters to join cards that may be hurting for spectacle, like say the under-the-table bonuses, which built this promotion. Crucially, what I just outlined helps to fix the short-term bout problem, right? The matchmakers have a $2 million budget to entice bigger names rather than whoever happens to be present, right? The positive downstream consequences could be immense. Now that is a functional structure that would completely invalidate my thesis. No one's gambling to pay rent when they are assured a payout of at least $150,000, right? Because right now that number is around $12,000 for Iridium fighters and reportedly lower for others unless you're coming in like Bo Nickel. My numbers can and will be easily picked apart, but I would ask you to genuinely consider if what I'm offering is that much off base or if we're splitting pubes here. If your hole poking requires ignoring the maths, the economic norms of every major sports league with comparable media deals, the documented desperation UFC fighters operate under, the actual gambling scandals, and the statistical normalization we just walked through together, then you're not critically thinking, you're asleep at the wheel. And then you say it. Devastating in its elegance, cutting me straight to my core. But Jason, what about Chauncey Billups? Fuck! My throat tightens. I feel the stress in my teeth. You're a fraud. Your intrusive nightmares about making a mistake online were right, Jason. Chauncey Billups' career earnings as an NBA player come out to approximately $100 million throughout his 17-year career. He was paid $4.7 million by the Trailblazers last year. He played during the Tim Donaghy era. My argument is crumbling before my very eyes. Tears are welling. Dad was right about me, wasn't he? Scary Terry Rozier is still coasting off the hype he generated as a Boston Celtic before Jason Tatum became whatever Jason Tatum is. Scary Terry's career earnings are north of $150 million. Only a single word can pass my lips. Psych. Little did you know, I loved 2004 NBA Finals MVP Chauncey Billups and was incredibly excited to see the effects he would have on some of my favorite NBA prospects as the new Portland Trailblazers coach. More than that, I will never forgive Danny Ainge for trading my favorite 2K player, Isaiah Thomas, after that horrible hip injury where he placed 5th in MVP voting the prior season in order to trade for Kyrie Irving in his peak flat earth era. I actively rooted against the Celtics for years over this and was constantly thwarted by Terry Rozier's talent again and again. As a Bulls fan in the early 2010s, I am incapable of describing the catharsis of watching the Heat hold on to his dead contract that they gave up Kyle Lowry in a protected first for. What I'm trying to get across is that athlete gambling isn't a situation you fix, it is a structural weakness you address. I could easily make "the NBA has a gambling problem" essay and reap multiple times the viewership of this, but crucially, they don't have a structural gambling problem. The inevitable consequence of legal gambling's system-corroding influence prioritizes volatility masquerading as virality over competitive legitimacy. Read the comments of any viral sports TikTok or reel. It is rife with people questioning the legitimacy of this reffing decision or that aberrant behavior. This is largely about the paranoia of some viewers representing a risk to leagues like the NBA. That is the fault of legal gambling and is not unique to any one sport. Critically, the UFC has a gambling disorder caused by the merging of the loss of legitimacy that is accepted when you sign those gambling deals with their systemic suppression of fighter pay as a percentage of revenue. A fighter who makes $12,000 a show and another $12 to win does not live in the same moral universe as a fighter making $150K minimum. Scarcity doesn't just pressure behavior, it collapses optionality. If I am on the last fight of my deal and I tear my ACL training for a fight that I have to win to pay my credit card bills, I will reluctantly consider gambling on my own outcome more and more just to hedge against literal existential economic risk. The UFC systematically suppresses athlete pay to maintain artificially high margins, not because it is efficient or sustainable, but because it needs to cosplay as an 11-figure empire long enough to justify standing shoulder to shoulder with the WWE after Endeavor chose to package both brands as a single public asset. The cost of that decision is not abstract. The organization has been hollowed out to the point that when coaches are asked what additional revenue would change first, the answer is not innovation, expansion, or athlete development. It is finally paying assistant coaches a livable wage. A brand that quadrupled in valuation little more than half a decade should not require internal austerity to sustain its public narrative. When everyone but ownership is worse off after historic growth, the problem is not execution, it is design.